So what I want to do today is go through some of the last features of the Quad Cortex that I haven't covered yet in all the other videos I've done on delays and reverbs and modulation and things like that. So today what I wanted to do was go through the noise gates and the freeze. And I'm going to use this compressor EQ test preset that I created when we were testing the compressors and EQ, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to get rid of all these and just strip it down to just the amp. And so what we have now is we just have a Lone Star into a 2x12 with a little bit of reverb on the end. It sounds like this. And if we want, we can add in a little bit of gain with this Victory Jack preamp capture that I created. But we'll leave that off for now. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the noise reduction on the input block. And we'll talk about this in a second too when we're talking about the noise gates. So let's go ahead and add in a noise gate. And we're going to go to the utilities section. And two blocks I want to talk about here that I'm not going to cover today are the gain and the volume blocks. I did a whole video comparing those two, and I'll link to it here. And we're going to skip those for today. So let's start with the utility gate because it's the most complex in terms of the number of settings it has, but I think it's a great block to use to talk about how noise gates work. So at their core, noise gate is there to stop low-level noise from coming through when you're not playing. So typically what happens is there's a level of loudness required for the gate to open. And then once the gate's open, everything comes through. And then once you drop below the level of that loudness level, it closes the gate so all that noise, like a 60-cycle hum or something like that, is not going to come through into your signal chain. So when we look at the controls here, the threshold is that level of loudness required to open the gate. In this case, our default is negative 80 decibels. We can go as low as 90. We can go as high as 0. If we go to 0, that means it lets nothing through. No matter how hard I play, nothing is getting through. The attack is the amount of time it takes for the gate to open once you exceed that threshold. So you can see here it's at 1 millisecond. So as soon as I exceed that threshold, it's opening the gate to let the sound through. If we pump it all the way up, what should happen is, as I start playing, it should take 1,000 milliseconds or a whole second for the noise gate to open. It's not doing that. So I don't know that this attack setting is actually working as it's supposed to. But typically you wouldn't want to do that anyway. You'd want to keep it pretty low because you want the noise gate to be pretty responsive. But that's one thing I noticed here is the attack function on the utility gate seems to be behaving strangely, in my opinion. So let's skip hold for a second and talk about release. So release is the amount of time it takes for the gate to close once you drop below the threshold. So once it decides to close the gate, it will, in this case, the default is 40 milliseconds. It'll take 40 milliseconds to close the gate once it decides I'm going to close the gate. So again, the default of that is pretty low. You can go as high as 5 seconds. I don't know that you would ever want to do that. Typically, you want a noise gate to be pretty responsive. The hold is the amount of time it'll take once you drop below the threshold before it triggers the gate to close. And this is useful if you're doing, let's say you're using this on a vocal. In between vocal lines, you don't want the gate going on and off all the time, just because the singer is taking a breath or something like that. So this would allow you the ability to keep it from triggering the close of the gates when you're taking a small pause in your playing. So again, typically this is pretty low. The default is 10 milliseconds. And so the difference is, so after you drop below the threshold, the hold is the amount of time the effect waits before it starts to close the gate, and the release is the amount of time it takes to close the gate. So that's the difference. And then range is the amount of attenuation that actually happens when the gate is closed. So typically this is off, which basically means it's 100% attenuated, meaning when the gate is closed, nothing gets through. It's 0 dB. If you raise this up, you can adjust the amount of how much you want it to close. Again, the default is off, meaning it attenuates 100%. Nothing gets through. But if you wanted to raise this up and it'll go all the way to minus 6 dB, this is basically meaning it's not reducing the signal to 0. It's not really closing the gate all the way. It's just reducing the volume of the signal coming through. So again, usually I would leave that down and off. So I don't usually use the utility gate very often. I think this is something, maybe if you were running vocals through the quad cortex or something like that, you might want to have this noise gate on for whatever reason. But typically for guitar, I don't use this very much. But I think it was a good way to kind of describe how a gate works. So let's get rid of that. And we'll add in a simple gate. And you can see a simple gate just has a threshold. So you set the signal level when it'll close and open the gate. And you can see here, there's no release, there's no attack. If you go to the adaptive gate is a similar kind of thing where you have a level of noise reduction, but it's automatically setting things as you're playing. So this is less about you want to set the specific threshold or attack and release and those things, and you just want to say, hey, I just want noise reduced overall. You can even put this down at 0 and get some amount of noise reduction. So let's go ahead and turn on our gain, and I'm going to add in a compressor for this. And then, because then when we turn our gate off, we can hear the noise. So there's our noise. When we turn the gate on, even with the noise reduction at 0, it's cutting off that noise. If I raise it up, you can hear, even when I'm playing, it's a little noisier. You're getting more of that hum coming through. But just to show you, the adaptive gate is automatically setting thresholds and managing that for you. And so the simple gate and the adaptive gate will work pretty similarly. I'll usually use the adaptive gate because I don't want to have that much control over the gate, honestly. I just want it to reduce that hum, that noise is coming through the signal. And I typically, if I'm going to use an adaptive gate, a lot of times I'll leave it at 0 and it'll be smart enough to just get rid of the hiss. But I will say that anymore, I typically do not use the adaptive gate block. What I'll do is I will turn on the noise reduction on the input gate control. And this, to me, works pretty much exactly the same way. I set it at 0%. You can see it's reducing the gain. If I turn it off, we hear our hiss. Turn on, it's off. So typically for me, when I'm playing a guitar preset, I just put the input gate on the input block here, and I don't use the specific gate blocks. The only time I might do that is sometimes there's a few blocks in the overdrive pedals and things like that that might introduce their own noise, and I might want to put an adaptive gate after that overdrive pedal or something like that. It's not very common. I hardly ever do it. So it's one thing that, they added that noise gate on the input block. I forget which release it was, but prior to that, I used to always use an input gate, an adaptive gate on the very front of every preset. And some of my older presets, you might still find that there. And what I do now is I just turn on the input gate on the input block, and I don't waste a block here for a gate. So let's go ahead and talk about the freeze. So the freeze is here under morph. It's the only thing under morph. And usually let's put that on the tail end here. So what the freeze is doing is allowing you to freeze a signal and then play over top of it. So let's go ahead and assign that to a foot switch. I'm going to assign that to E. I have to assign it to a foot switch because it is no longer auto-assigning foot switches. Yay. All right. So what happens here is it allows you to freeze like a chord or something or a note and then play over top of it. So for instance, if I just freeze a kind of a basic G chord, the way this works is you play a note, then you hit the freeze button, and it'll freeze that note and allow you to play over top of it. And we'll talk about the momentary and the attack and the release in a second. The dry gain is the level of your playing once you've frozen the background note. The freeze gain is the volume level of the note that's frozen. And then you can put a high pass and low pass filter on this if you want to. So, for example, if I play a G chord and then I hit the foot switch to freeze it, you can hear it's frozen now. I can bring the level down a little bit, and then I can play over top. Can even pump up the level of the playing a little bit. And then I just hit the foot switch again to turn it off. So that's the basics of how it works. So the attack and release are basically what you would expect. The attack is the amount of time it takes for the freeze signal to fade in, and the release is the amount of time it takes to fade out once you turn it off. So, for example, if I pump these up all the way, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit my G chord, and then I'm going to hit the foot switch, and you're going to hear it fade in over 5 seconds because that's the attack time. And then we'll turn it off when we hear it fade out over 5 seconds. So here's the G chord. You can hear the freezes fading in. I can play over top. Then I hit the foot switch. And it's fading out over 5 seconds. And then the last piece is this momentary. And basically what this does is sets whether or not you need to keep your foot on the foot switch to keep the freeze on. So if you took momentary on, if I hit a G and then I hit the foot switch, it doesn't stay on. It only freezes as long as I keep the foot switch depressed. This could be very useful if you wanted to like hit a chord, play over top of it, and then switch to another chord and play over top of that. So I could do like this. So you can kind of take your foot on and off the switch to make it freeze different notes as you're playing. It takes a lot of coordination because you have to hit the notes before you hit the freeze. So that's the freeze. It can be kind of fun to play with. It's kind of I think of it like a poor man's looper a little bit. My main criticism with it is the tone of the notes, I think, get a little synthy. It doesn't sound like the guitar underneath it. So I don't use it very much, but it is kind of that, if you want to kind of hit a chord and then play over top of it for a little while, I think it gives you that freedom a little bit. The looper is probably a better option for that. So those are the noise gates and the freeze effect. I think the only thing left for us to do that we haven't covered already is the looper. I may do another video on that. That's a little more complicated. There's a lot more ins and outs about how to use that. And I'll have to think through the best way to kind of present it and go through it. If you have any questions on this, feel free to throw it in the questions below. And as always, thanks for watching.